Hi my dear students, welcome back to the second part of this video lesson on Quest for a Theory of Everything by Gail Ferguson. You remember in the first part we discussed how Stephen Hawking could become a world-renowned physicist and mathematician in spite of his disabilities, in spite of his crippling disease and his total disabilities. So what is the secret of his success? What actually helped him succeed in life in spite of all those physical disabilities? He could succeed only because he focused on his abilities and simply ignored his disabilities. This was the only secret of his success. So you just see this clipping on the screen. What do you see here? See what Stephen Hawking is doing here. He is floating in zero gravity. He is undergoing a rigorous training. Zero gravity training. We call it zero gravity training. This was his preparation for a space trip. Actually, he was planning to make a trip to space. And unfortunately, he couldn't fulfill that dream. He died even before he could fulfill that dream. But think about a man. Imagine a man who has an almost fully paralyzed body, undergoing such rigorous training in zero gravity. So zero gravity training is something very challenging even for the healthiest of men. But see this man taking up that challenge. That is Stephen Hawking. He has proven that if we have the will to succeed, if we have the will to overcome our difficulties, no power on earth can stop us from achieving success. So dear children, in the first part of this profile, we read how Stephen Hawking contracted a very rare disease, an incurable disease at the age of 21, when he was doing his PhD at Cambridge. What is the name of that disease? The disease is called Amniotropic Lateral Sclerosis. It is shortly called ALS, Amniotropic Lateral Sclerosis. And before we read the rest of the profile, it would be better if we know how this disease, ALS, affects human body. So let us first watch a short clipping, a short video on how ALS or Amniotropic Lateral Sclerosis affects human body. So let us watch it and come back to read the rest of the profile.
ALS stands for Amniotropic Lateral Sclerosis. It is a motor neuron disease and therefore in some countries better known as MND. In the US, the disease is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease after a famous baseball player who died of ALS. ALS is a neurologic disorder that causes increasing muscle weakness and eventually paralysis, which, in most cases, is fatal. Our brain sends signals through our nervous system to make our muscles move. ALS affects the motor neurons that carry these signals. The neurons in the brain and the spinal cord degenerate and die, causing the muscles to gradually weaken and the brain to lose control over voluntary muscle movement. This leads to all sorts of problems, such as increasing loss of mobility in the limbs and difficulties with speech, swallowing, and even breathing. ALS is an irreversible and progressive disease. Patients usually die within 3 to 5 years after diagnosis, primarily due to failure of the respiratory muscles. Each year, 1 to 2 people per 100,000 are diagnosed with ALS. Scientists don't yet know how or why the disease develops, and unfortunately there is no cure or treatment today. It is currently only possible to slow down the progression of the disease.
Dear children, you have got a very clear idea about how ALS affects human body. This disease affects the nerve cells in the brain as well as in the spinal cord. And gradually the patient loses control over his muscles. And his body gets paralyzed. This is what happened in the case of Stephen Hawking as well. It's a deadly disease, it is incurable, and in most cases the patient dies within a period of 2 to 5 years. But in the case of Stephen Hawking, he could survive for more than 55 years after getting diagnosed with ALS. And he is a miracle for medical science. And maybe his determination, his iron will helped him overcome this crippling disease. So dear children, if you want to know more about how he struggled against this crippling disease, you please watch the Hollywood film Theory of Everything. It's a biopic made on the life of Stephen Hawking. You would certainly enjoy watching it, and I think it is available on YouTube. You please watch it and try to know more about Stephen Hawking and how he struggled all through his life against this crippling disease, amniotropic lateral sclerosis. So dear children, I hope you remember what we did in the first part of this profile. In the first part, we read about Stephen Hawking's childhood, his college life at Oxford, and how he showed the initial symptoms of amniotropic lateral sclerosis while he was at Cambridge during that first year at Cambridge. And what kind of a boy he was at Oxford. He was a lively, buoyant and adaptable boy. And his friends loved him for his lively, buoyant and adaptable nature. And he loved classical music and science fiction. And he took part in sports. And he was very well known for his wit, his sense of humor. His friends loved him for his sense of humor. And before he was diagnosed with ALS. Before he contracted this disease, he was just like anybody else. He was just like all of you. He loved his college life like everybody else. And if you go through his life, you would find two distinct phases in his life. One is life before ALS, and then the life after ALS. After his getting diagnosed with ALS, his life was a struggle against that crippling disease. So this is how you could divide his life into two phases, distinct phases. Life before ALS and life after ALS. So what were those initial symptoms he showed while he was doing his PhD at Cambridge? During that first year at Cambridge, what initial symptoms he showed? He had difficulty in talking. He had difficulty in tying shoes. Those were early signs of this disease. How he was losing control of his own muscles. But unfortunately, it was not diagnosed at that time. It was diagnosed only later. So dear children, let us now read the next part of the profile, and once you read it, we'll be back with some questions to have a detailed discussions.
Shortly after his 21st birthday in 1963, Hawking contracted a rare disease, amniotropic lateral sclerosis, for which there was no known cure. It caused a gradual disintegration of the nerve cells in the spinal cord and the brain. At first, he went into a deep depression. He did not know what he ought to do or what his future would be like. My dreams at that time were rather confused, he admitted. Before my condition was diagnosed, I had been very bored with life. There did not seem to be anything worth doing. But shortly after I came out of hospital, I dreamt that I was going to be executed. I suddenly realized that there were a lot of worthwhile things to do if I were reprieved. Another recurring dream was the idea of sacrificing my life to save others. After all, if I were going to die, I might as well do some good. Hawking's doctors hoped that his condition would stabilize, but the disease aggravated rapidly. They soon informed him that he had only about 2 more years to live. 2 years passed. The progression of the disease had slowed. I didn't die. In fact, although there was a cloud hanging over my future, I found to my surprise that I was enjoying life in the present more than before. Total disability and death, though still a not too distant certainty, were postponed. Hawking had his reprieve. a precarious and a temporary one, but life was precious.
Dear children, you have seen how tragedy struck Stephen Hawking soon after his 21st birthday. What was that tragedy? The tragedy came in the form of a deadly disease, an incurable disease, amniotropic lateral sclerosis. And what was his immediate response to this? He went into a deep depression. But soon he could overcome it, and he started enjoying life more than ever before. It shows his strong will and his never dying spirit. And what were the dreams? What kinds of dreams he had in those days? Soon after he got discharged from hospital, what kind of dreams he had? What kind of dreams he had? He had all kinds of unpleasant dreams. He dreamt that he was going to be executed. But then he realized that he had very little time left. He realized that he had to do something worthwhile if he were reprieved. Reprieve means to get temporary relief. To get temporary relief. And he thought if he were reprieved, if he got some relief, if he got a reprieve from that punishment, he should do something worthwhile. And he also had some other dreams. Another recurring dream was the idea of sacrificing his own life for others. Recurring means happening repeatedly, occurring repeatedly. So another recurring dream he had was the idea of sacrificing himself for saving others. So this shows he was not ready to give up. He didn't lose hope. He wanted to make full use of the time available. He was sure that he had not much time left, but he wanted to make full use of that time available. And what hope did the doctors express? What hope did the doctors express? The doctors expressed the hope that his condition would stabilize. They were hopeful that his condition would stabilize, but were they proven right? They were proven wrong. His condition got worse. His disease aggravated. Aggravate means to get worse. His disease aggravated. His disease got worse. And now doctors told that he had only 2 more years to live. Doctors told him that he had only 2 more years to live. And what change did he notice once the progression of his disease slowed down? So even after 2 years he didn't die, rather the condition got better, the progression of his disease slowed down. And what change he noticed? He noticed the change that he was enjoying life more than ever before. That shows this tragedy did not make him weaker, rather it made him stronger. Not physically. Physically he was getting weaker and weaker, but mentally he was getting tougher and tougher, stronger and stronger. There is a saying in English, test of fire makes fine steel. Test of fire makes fine steel. And this saying is absolutely true about Stephen Hawking. This tragedy did not make him weaker, rather it made him stronger and stronger. He faced this tragedy without losing his hope, and he came out successful. And he came out stronger. This is what we learn from the life of Stephen Hawking. Even when he faced such a tragedy in his life, he didn't lose his hope, rather he fought hard and came out stronger. So dear children, now let us move on to the next part of the profile. You please read it on the screen and we'll be back for further discussion on that.
At a New Year's party at St. Albans, just before he entered the hospital for tests, Hawking met Jane Wilde. To her, this dishevelled graduate student seemed terribly intelligent, eccentric, and rather arrogant. But he was interesting, and she liked his wit. When Jane met him again after his discharge from the hospital, he was really in a pathetic state. I think he's lost his will to live. He was very confused. she commented. She was not, however, put off by his physical or mental condition. She was rather a shy teenager, serious-minded, with a strong faith in God, ingrained from childhood by her mother, and a belief that good can come out of any adversity. Hawking admired her optimism, and their friendship developed slowly. After a while, the two began to realize, in Jane's words, that together we could make something worthwhile. For Stephen, that made all the difference. He applied for a research fellowship at Caius, one of the colleges in Cambridge University. In 1965, at the age of 23, Hawking received his fellowship at Caius, and in July of the same year, Jane and he were married. People who remember Hawking in the university in the late 1960s recall him making his way around the corridors with a cane, supporting himself against the wall. He spoke with what sounded like a slight speech impediment, but more than that, they remember his brashness in sessions involving some of the world's most distinguished scientists. While other young researchers kept a reverential silence, Hawking daringly asked unexpected and penetrating questions. He clearly knew what he was talking about. His reputation as a genius, another Einstein, began then.
Dear children, you have seen how Jane Hawking made a huge difference in the life of Stephen Hawking. It was at such a crucial period of his life that Stephen Hawking met this girl, Jane Wilde. And it was Jane Wilde who instilled confidence in him. But for her support, he couldn't have overcome the deep depression he got into soon after his diagnosis with ALS. And we say, behind every successful man there is a woman. And Jane was the woman behind the success of Stephen Hawking. We could say for sure. And where did Stephen Hawking meet Jane? Where did Stephen Hawking meet Jane Wilde? He met Jane Wilde at a New Year's party at St. Albans. And what was her impression of Stephen Hawking, her first impression? What was her first impression of Stephen Hawking? He found this disheveled young boy to be terribly intelligent, a bit eccentric, and very arrogant. But he was interesting, and she liked his wit. So, disheveled means untidy, not neatly kept. So she found this disheveled young boy, this untidy young boy, she found to be very arrogant, a little eccentric, and very intelligent, terribly intelligent. But he was interesting, and she loved his wit. And then, what kind of a girl Jane was? Jane was a very shy teenager. A very shy teenager, very serious-minded. And she had a strong faith in God, ingrained from her childhood by her mother. And the most attractive trait of her character was that she was very optimistic. She believed that good could come out of even an adverse situation. So it was this trait, it was this optimism that appealed to Stephen the most. Hawking found this optimism in her very attractive, very appealing. So how did this relationship, how did this friendship influence Stephen Hawking's life? This friendship had a very positive influence on his life. And he himself acknowledges it when he says his affair with Jane Hawking made all the difference in his life. It was she who instilled confidence in him. And he applied for a fellowship at Caius, a college in the University of Cambridge. And in the year 1965, he got that fellowship. And the very year, in the year 1965 itself, they got married. Jane and Stephen Hawking got married in the year 1965. And what do people recall about Stephen Hawking's life in that university? What do people recall about Stephen Hawking's life in the University of Cambridge? People recall him moving about in the corridors with a cane, supporting himself against the wall. By that time, he couldn't walk properly. He had to take the support of a cane as well as support himself against the wall. So they remember him moving about in the corridors with a cane and supporting himself against the wall. They remember him having some slight speech impediment. Speech impediment means difficulty in speaking. So they remember him having that slight speech impediment. But above all, they remember his brashness. Brashness means boldness in an aggressive way, boldness in an arrogant way. So they remember him for his brashness in the sessions attended by world-renowned scientists. When other students kept a reverential silence, when they all kept silent, this boy showed the guts to ask penetrating questions. He asked unexpected and penetrating questions. And this was how he earned the nickname, another Einstein. This was how he got the reputation of being a genius. So this is what he is remembered for. All his friends remember him for his brashness, his confidence in asking very unexpected and penetrating questions, even to the best of scientists in the world. So dear children, we have come to the end of that. Let us move on to the next part of the profile. And once you read that, we'll be back with a few more questions for a discussion.
In 1980, a practical need for funds launched him into a new enterprise that was to have a far-reaching impact on the Hawkings and others all around the world. He thought of writing a book about the universe, about the most interesting questions that had made him want to study cosmology and quantum theory. Where did the universe come from? Is the universe infinite, or does it have any boundaries? Will it come to an end? If so, how? Is there a complete theory of the universe and everything in it? Is there a beginning of time? Could time run back? The book begins by rewinding the great theories of the cosmos from Newton to Einstein. He wrote the book to make a science understandable to non-scientists. He completed the first draft in 1984. While the revision process was going on, he made a trip to Switzerland. There he was down with pneumonia and was left on a life support system. Doctors gave a choice as to whether a tracheotomy operation which would remove his windpipe should be conducted or not. It might save his life, but afterwards he would never again be able to speak or make a vocal sound. With grave misgivings, Jane consented. The future looked very bleak. Jane remarked. Hawking could no longer breathe through his mouth and nose, but only through a permanent opening made in his throat. After many weeks of intensive care, he went home to join Jane and his 3 children. He was still too weak and ill to continue his research. Walt Wolters, a computer expert in California, sent him a program he had developed called the Equalizer, which allowed Hawking to select words from the screen.
Dear children, you have read how Stephen Hawking started writing his book, A Brief History of Time. And in fact, this book earned him global recognition as a genius, as another Einstein. It became so popular, more than 10 million copies were sold. But even before completing that book, tragedy struck him once again. This time, it was in the form of pneumonia. And what actually made him write this book? What made him write this book? Actually, a practical need for funds made him write this book. That means that he was in a financial difficulty, and to get over that difficulty, he thought of writing this book. And what are the questions that he tries to answer in this book? What are the questions he tries to answer? In this book, he tries to answer all those questions that made him study cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the universe, especially the origin and evolution of the universe. So he tries to answer all those questions that haunted him, all those questions that made him study cosmology. Questions like, where did the universe come from? That means where did it originate from? And whether the universe is infinite or whether it has boundaries. Infinite means that which has no boundaries, endless. Then thirdly, whether the universe will come to an end, whether this universe will come to an end. Or next, is there a theory of everything that could explain everything that happens in this universe? And next, is there a beginning of time? And could time ever run back? These are all the questions. These are the questions he tries to answer here in this book. And what was the purpose of writing this book according to Stephen Hawking? What according to him was the purpose of writing this book? According to him, the purpose was to make science understandable to non-scientists. In a way, he succeeded in that because even ordinary people could read and understand scientific concepts in this book. So it was sold in large numbers. As I already told, 10 million copies were sold worldwide. So the purpose of writing that book, according to Stephen Hawking, was to help non-scientists understand science. Okay, then what tragedy struck him while he was on a trip to Switzerland in 1984? What was the tragedy that struck him? While he was on a trip to Switzerland, tragedy struck him in the form of pneumonia. He was infected with pneumonia and he was put on a life support system. And doctors told that the only way to save his life was to conduct a tracheotomy operation. Tracheotomy operation, you see the diagram here. Trachea is the windpipe through which we breathe in air. A tracheotomy operation is an operation by way of which trachea is removed, windpipe is removed. And once the trachea is removed, the patient can't breathe. So an opening is made on the throat of the patient through which he can breathe. So the only way to save Hawking's life was to conduct an operation, a tracheotomy operation. And with much misgivings, with a lot of apprehensions, Jane gave her consent. She knew that after that operation, Stephen Hawking would never be able to utter any sound. He would never be able to speak in his life. So at that age, at the age of 42, he lost his speech by way of this operation, tracheotomy operation. And how did Stephen Hawking overcome this difficulty? How did he overcome this difficulty? How did he overcome this difficulty? He overcame this difficulty with the help of a computer program developed by Walter Wolters, a computer expert in California. Walter Wolters developed this program called Equalizer, which helped Stephen Hawking select words from a list of words that appeared on the computer screen. So a lot of words would appear on the computer screen and he could select words by way of a sensor. In those days, he used his fingers to select words. But later on, his fingers also got paralyzed and he had to use his cheek muscles. So that is what you see in photographs. In later years, you see him, a sensor attached to his cheek. So he had to use his cheek muscles to select words. So for the 34 years in his life, he communicated to the rest of the world in this way. So this is what we have read here. Dear children, now please go on to read the last part of the profile. And once you read it, we'll be back for further discussion on that.
He thought he would be unable to finish his book. With the support of his student, Brian Witt, A Brief History of Time was published in 1988. September 2005 saw the release of an abridged version of the original book. This version was updated to address the new issues that had arisen due to further scientific developments. One will encounter a multitude of paradoxes in the book. In science and with people, things are often not what they seem, and pieces that ought to fit together refuse to do so. You will learn that beginnings may be endings. Cruel circumstances can lead to happiness, although fame and success may not. Two great scientific theories taken together seem to give us nonsense. Empty space isn't empty. Black holes aren't black. And a man whose appearance inspires shock and pity takes us laughing to where the boundaries of time and space ought to be, but are not. It is, of course, a miracle that Hawking has been able to achieve everything he has, that he is still alive. However, when you experience his intelligence and humor, you begin to take his unusual mode of communication and his obviously catastrophic physical problems no more seriously than he seems to himself. That is exactly the way he wants it. He chooses to ignore the difficulty, and he expects others to adopt the same attitude. Stephen Hawking.
So, dear children, you have now read the whole profile. You have seen how Stephen Hawking sets a good example for all of us. He sets an example by ignoring his difficulties, ignoring his disabilities, and focusing only on his abilities. And he expects the same thing from others as well. He doesn't want others to feel sorry for his disabilities. He wants others to focus on his abilities, on his intelligence. And we have read that in the beginning, he was doubtful whether he would be able to complete his book, A Brief History of Time. He was a bit doubtful. And who helped him in completing this book? One of his students, Brian Witt. One of his students named Brian Witt helped him in completing this book. And this book was published in 1988. And an abridged version of the same book was published again in 2005. Abridged version means a shortened version. So this book was first published in 1988, and then a shortened version of the same book was published in 2005. And in this book, you would come across plenty of paradoxes, a multitude of paradoxes. By the way, what is a paradox? You see these examples. What we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. What we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. On the face of it, it is self-contradictory. There is some contradiction in it. It sounds insensible. But it does convey a possible truth. So any statement or a situation that seems self-contradictory and at the same time conveys a possible truth is called a paradox. So this is a paradox. It simply means we don't learn anything from history. So we come across plenty of such paradoxes in this book, A Brief History of Time. What are those paradoxes? Stephen Hawking says that both in life and in science, we come across plenty of paradoxes. And he lists out a few such paradoxes in this book. He says, both in life and in science, pieces that ought to fit together don't always fit together. He says, beginnings may be endings, both in science and in life. He says, cruel circumstances may sometimes lead to happiness, whereas success and fame may not. He says that black holes are not black and empty space is not empty. So you would come across such paradoxes in this book. A multitude of paradoxes, plenty of such paradoxes you come across in this book. So dear children, we have come to the end of it. And what do you learn from the life of this man? After reading this profile, what do you learn from the life of this great man, this wonderful personality? We learn that if we have the will to succeed, no matter what difficulties we face in life, no matter what disabilities we suffer from, no power on earth can stop us from achieving our goal. If we have the will to succeed. So dear children, hereafter, whenever you feel that you are less fortunate than others, just bring this face to your mind. Just remember Stephen Hawking, then you would realize how blessed you are. You could derive a lot of inspiration from this great man, Stephen Hawking. So we have had a very long session. Let us now wind up. Okay, goodbye.